Well, welcome everyone to our webinar today, U.S. Energy Policy in 2025, Unpacking a Year of Disruption. I'm your co-moderator, Jason Dick. I'm the editor-in-chief of CQ and Roll Call. And joining me in moderating today is Caitlin Hendel, our editor for CQ's Capital Power Daily Newsletter. This webinar is hosted by Fiscal Note, our parent company, and also home to Policy Note, Voter Voice, and much more. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping notes. We'll be recording this session and we'll share it with you via email later this week so that you can see it on demand. It'll also be on our Fiscal Note parent website under webinars. We also want to encourage you to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. Afterwards, also, we will love you to stick around for just a teeny bit longer. We'll have a QR code, which we can take a survey that's confidential, but would help us to tailor future webinars and to meet more of the needs that you have. But today, let's get everything started. We're going to discuss developments in U.S. energy policy, what to expect from the administration, as much as we can tell, strategies for staying ahead of the change that we've seen, and perhaps more to come. Joining our conversation today is Kelly Livingston, a reporter for CQ's daily Capital Power newsletter. Welcome, Kelly. And David Jordan, our energy and environment reporter at CQ and Roll Call. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. We just have an hour today. We'll get to as many Q&As as we can, submit them as they come up, but we also have a lot to discuss. And right now, I just want to hand it over to my colleague, Caitlin.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Fiscal Note, for hosting this important webinar. Let's start with our Capital Power newsletter reporter, Kelly Livingston. Kelly, what are your key takeaways for energy policy this year?
Well, thanks, Caitlin, and thank you to Jason. Very excited to be here. When I think back over this year, I think the most striking thing to me is that we are in the middle of really a 180-degree shift in federal energy priorities and policies from one administration to the next. So the previous administration under President Joe Biden put billions of dollars and a lot of regulatory support across multiple government agencies behind building out what they had hoped would be a renewable energy transition. But since President Trump took office in January, he and his administration have made it their policy to roll back much of that effort. So we've seen a slew of rescissions of renewable energy funds and project approvals across the EPA, Energy, Interior, and Transportation departments. And as the administration has tried to pull back federal investment for projects like wind and solar, they've also put a lot of resources and support behind liquefied natural gas, coal, and nuclear power. So there's been a lot of reasons that the administration has given for some of these actions, but they largely come down to a matter of stated preference for what they call energy-dense baseload power. Their argument is that they'll get more power relative to the resources and spatial footprint that they need for nuclear, LNG, and coal, so they'd prefer to utilize more of those and stop providing subsidies to wind and solar, which they say are less reliable. So there's been some big pushback to that, obviously from environmental groups who are concerned about the emissions and climate ramifications of such a shift. They've launched a series of lawsuits against pretty much every effort to rescind and repeal these funds and approvals. But we've also seen some indirect criticism from industry because they're saying these big policy swings aren't good for them either. They need predictability in order to make long-term plans. Now, Congress has tried and in some cases succeeded to codify some of this shift in its own priorities and policy. If we look at the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, they pretty dramatically tightened the timeline to qualify for some of these renewable energy tax credits that were implemented under President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. And that could lead to some project cancellations in cases where companies were counting on those subsidies. And there are also some bills under consideration right now that would change the approvals process for LNG facilities to speed up some of those project approvals. So the administration has said that their preference for this firm baseload power is what they need to address increasing energy demand, particularly amid the rise of AI. And their immediate solution to that rising demand so far has been largely natural gas and coal, but the long-term hope is the build-out of nuclear power. They've implemented some really ambitious goals when it comes to nuclear, inviting some private companies to come and test small modular reactors of fission designs on DOE lands in the hopes of speeding up that approvals process as well, and getting 3 SMRs to criticality by next July. So they're in the testing phase as well for advanced nuclear co-location with AI data centers. And they're again bringing private industry onto federal lands to do some of that research. They've also started looking further ahead, launching a roadmap for the build out of nuclear fusion, which hasn't yet been sustained, in the hopes of having that technology online in the next 10 years or so. So there's going to be a long lead time on that development, but experts have said that the US is going to need to invest billions more on that front in order to succeed in achieving fusion. So as I said, a lot of different shifts happening here, and we'll see how all of these efforts play out in the years to come.
Thank you, Kelly. That's a very interesting perspective. And David, what in particular struck you as interesting this year?
The big thing for me is having covered this under the previous administration, you didn't hear affordability as much of an argument. And over the past 5 years, residential electricity prices have risen by about 40%. And it varies depending on what part of the country you're in, but in the Northeast, New England, and on the Pacific Coast, that's where it's been the largest. And politicians are obviously becoming aware of this. They're hearing from their constituents that, there's an overall affordability crisis in America on things that, we won't discuss on this call, but electricity prices, especially residential electricity prices, is one of the biggest areas. And, last month we saw uh, incoming governors Spanberger and Sherrill win with pretty large margins in New Jersey and Virginia. And that was largely on a affordability campaign. One aspect of this is both of those states are part of PJM, which is a grid operator in the mid-Atlantic. And it's also the grid operator for a lot of these data centers. And so those incoming governors are part of, a coalition of other Democratic governors who are very critical of how PJM is operating and arguing they aren't doing enough to bring on new electricity quickly enough. But Republicans recognize this as well, but there's still a pretty large gulf on how they address it. Republicans in Congress generally mirror what Kelly was talking about in what she was just saying, where they want to bring on baseload power. So that's gas, that's nuclear, coal, and some renewables like geothermal and kind of large dams out west. But Democrats are saying you cannot ignore solar and wind. And there has been some agreement with industry where they're saying solar is the easiest and cheapest for us to bring on immediately. And demand is rising quickly with the AI boom we have now. You can't bring it online quickly enough. So, going into 2026, I think affordability is just going to be this word we're going to be hearing constantly. And if, these issues continue through next summer and people see their residential energy prices rising the same rate, voters are going to go to the ballot box with that in mind.
Okay, thank you both. Before we start to dig a little deeper into those issues, I'd like to remind those of you who have joined us, if you have questions for Kelly and David, please put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. Okay, Kelly, tell us about the factors you're seeing that are driving the disruption in energy policy this year.
Sure. So again, the major disruption for me is coming from these decisions to rescind and repeal the previous administration's efforts to develop renewable power across the country. And because that choice is coupled with the decision to focus on more energy-dense sources, natural gas, nuclear, coal, it's just a massive priority shift from the previous administration that had been putting more effort toward its response to climate change. And that concern that was driving the Biden administration really lent itself to more consideration of renewables. But this administration not only wants more power on the grid, they're saying they want particular kinds of power coming from sources that they consider more reliable. They've cited a lot of concerns about the intermittency of renewables, that they're not running constantly all of the time, that they're dependent on the sun and the wind in order to make power. So they've said not all electrons are created equal. That's part of their concern here. They say we want to prioritize some forms of energy over others. And of course, the demand is certainly there to justify a desire for more power. We're seeing an increasing electricity demand for the first time in about 20 years after relatively flat growth during that period. But the question that the administration has been getting a lot, particularly from Democrats, is if we need more power on the grid, why not let some of these wind and solar projects that were already in development and in some cases nearly complete go forward? Their answer to that so far has generally gone back to concerns about intermittency. But in the course of my reporting, experts have told me repeatedly that there are some ways to firm up renewables by either wider spatial arrangements in the case of a wind farm or coupling some of these projects with battery storage. So I still have some questions there myself.
One thing I think also, Kelly, is that you mentioned the demand, the increased demand for energy and for the first time in a long time. And we saw a little bit of an uptick with sort of more wide scale acceptance or adoption of electric cars. But the AI boom is just this huge energy consumer.
Mhm.
And while the administration is like lukewarm at best on electric vehicles, boy, they are full in on development of AI, and that so they're reaching a point where I think the economics, it seems, are going to be difficult to like those will take over where people will just have to embrace some other like the all of the above approach
Mhm.
of wind energy, nuclear, coal, I don't know,
Sure.
algal bloom, burning, whatever. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when George W. Bush mentioned switchgrass as an energy source in a State of the Union. So how close do you think we are to getting a critical mass of particularly tech companies who seem to have the ear of the White House saying, "Hey, boss, we need more energy no matter where it comes from, and we can't wait 10 years for fusion to get here."
Hmm. Well, I think we're already seeing some of that, particularly from Republicans in Congress who are saying we want all of the above. A lot of these states in the Midwest and across the middle part of the country have a lot of wind, a lot of solar, and they're a little bit um, they're towing a delicate line, I think, with this White House in terms of responding to what their constituents want and need, and also trying to appease the president. But when you talk about industry, I think that's sort of where the nuclear piece comes in. At least so far, the White House's answer to concerns from industry have been let's build out small modular reactors, which is a newer form of fission technology. It's smaller, it's easier to scale. I think that's sort of the great white hope of this White House to deal with the power demands of AI. Whether or not the goals that they've put in place for that are realistic is something that remains to be seen. And I've gotten kind of different answers from different parts of this debate on that. I do think at a certain point, we will see a critical mass of Republicans who are saying, we need to be a little bit less prescriptive about what forms of energy we're using. Whether or not that's enough to pressure this White House to change its policies is a different question.
Okay, good question. Okay, I'm going to turn our conversation over to Congress now. The reconciliation bill that was signed into law this summer, it's known by a lot of people as the One Big Beautiful Bill, did much to undo President Joe Biden's energy work. David, could you please tell us about those key revisions in that bill that proved to be the most disruptive?
Yeah, so the one big thing that Kelly touched on a little bit earlier is how it changed subsidies. So the IRA provided a lot of funding to agencies, a lot of which was the unspent money was rescinded through the one big beautiful bill, and then it also provided a lot of tax credits to kind of incentivize these, upstart industries, things like sustainable aviation fuel, for instance, that is something that's been kind of a, pipe dream for years. The hope from the Biden administration was, well, if we make it just a little bit easier for them to commercialize that technology, then it'll be, off like a rocket. That was the Biden administration's hope. And the Republicans came in and said, we just do not see the point in subsidizing a lot of these industries. A lot of them have been around for a long time, which was their biggest criticism of solar and wind. I can't, tell you the number of times a Republican member of Congress on the Hill during reconciliation told me, wind and solar, they've been around for decades. If, they can't operate without government subsidies, they're never going to operate. So that was what they kind of went into the One Big Beautiful Bill negotiations with. And so it rescinded a lot of the tax credits. And, there was a lot of tinkering around the edges. At one point, it went kind of to the extreme of one end of ending them all very quickly. They pared that back a little because moderate members like Murkowski and then some of those people from the Midwest, like Grassley and Ernst and Moran, who have a lot of wind, said, we can't just pull the rug out from under them. So that was the biggest thing. And then there's also a lot of provisions to kind of increase mining, increase oil production, and coal leasing on federal public lands. The bill included provisions to it, induce mining on in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the National Petroleum Reserve, two big portions of Alaska where they've Republicans have wanted drilling for decades, and they did that in their original bill, and it wasn't quite as successful, so they kind of went a little bit further in hopes of trying to get people to drill in that part of the country. But yeah, I think industry is still adjusting a little bit to kind of what the post, IRA, post One Big Beautiful Bill signed into law, how that will affect the industry. It's only been a couple months, but some of them still seem pretty hopeful, and Democrats still seem pretty hopeful that there's still the economic case for wind and solar, even in this post, without the tax credits, because it is cheaper, it is easier to bring on quickly. That was one of the reasons you actually had Tom Tillis, one of the few Republicans who didn't vote for the bill, saying, yes, gas may be this baseload power that is a little bit more dependable than wind and solar because it doesn't rely on the weather. But in the short term, we cannot bring anything online as quickly as we can solar, and we need power today.
And David, just to follow up with that too, I mean the irony of saying, well, wind and solar have been around for a while and the subsidies haven't stuck. I mean, you could make an argument that oil and gas are still
Mhm.
heavily subsidized, and they're even older
Yeah.
industries. And you mentioned the some of the ANWR and Alaska, drilling, provisions. That I mean, if I remember it right, there was an auction for drilling, spots and leases there that where nobody bid on them because it just wasn't economically, it didn't make any sense economically,
Mhm.
to drill there because there's plenty of oil in Texas. And plenty of oil in even, like in the continental United States. It's a lot easier to get to market than, finding a way around a bunch of, uh, caribou or whatever, or moose.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how those sales go through. The one thing Republicans kind of latched onto about that unsuccessful sale that happened like weeks before Joe Biden's inauguration in 2021 was them kind of saying, well, people weren't interested because, Biden was weeks away and they knew Biden wasn't going to be favorable to him. And during that auction, there was the only like lease that stuck after, a few months of going through the process was leases from an Alaskan state-owned corporation. Um, but the other, yeah, as you were saying, the other issue is it's expensive to drill there. You can't, in Texas, you can do it 12 months a year. Maybe you have to take a few weeks off in the summer, but in Alaska, you're looking at 5, 6 months
Oh,
max.
yeah. Yeah.
And there's varying studies that sound the price of a barrel of oil has to get to like 70 or 80 for it to be economical. And the EIA just said yesterday they expect continued downward pressure on oil through 2026. So, as every time you hear Trump talking about how low gas prices are, that means ANWR and NPRA are becoming less and less economical to drill.
And we had in the Capital Power newsletter this morning that solar is still going strong in many parts of the country. And the Solar Energy Industries Association has reported that the third quarter was one of the best ever for new solar projects. So, it makes you wonder whether the dropping of the subsidies and the tax credits will have how much effect it will really have on the industries, or whether they were already strong enough at that point to, which I guess is the argument that the administration is making, right? That they, if they can do it, they can do it on their own. David, speaking of Anwar, you've been seeing a lot of bills, resolutions, measures in the House and Senate recently in which the Congress is going after the CRA or using the CRA, the Congressional Review Act, to basically turn back the clock on the use of public lands. Could you talk about that? Describe how it works, what it means?
Yeah, so kind of quick run through the Congressional Review Act. It's this piece of legislation that was, part of Newt Gingrich's when he came into Congress, kind of redoing how Congress did business. It's basically creates a look back period for Congress where if any government agency finalizes a rule, Congress can say, well, we don't like that rule. We're going to pass a resolution that requires the president's signature that would both block the implementation of that rule and prevent the agency from finalizing anything that is substantially the same. And so that rule kind of or that law, the CRA, went unused until Trump's first term. It had been used once by Bush and then was used 17 or 18 times by Trump. And then they've come back in this year and they've taken an even more expansive view of the CRA. So they've done quite a few things with using the CRA to block from the Biden administration because the CRA works best in the first few months of a new administration because you figure a president has other ways to block his agency from doing something he doesn't like. So it works best when you have a new president coming in who would be willing to sign it. And so,
And also, just importantly, too, David, as is that it is immune to Senate filibuster rules. So
yes, yeah,
all
absolutely.
you need is a majority, so you don't have to, it gets kind of fast tracked in both the House and the
Yeah.
Senate. So,
And you can force a vote in the Senate. So even if Republicans are in the minority, when they didn't like Biden rules, sometimes they would force a symbolic vote on some of his rules. Um, but yeah, the Republicans have kind of expanded. They've done quite a few things with the CRA, and they've actually tinkered with Senate rules earlier this year to be able to block California has a waiver under the Clean Air Act allowing them to finalize their own vehicle emission rules, and they use the CRA to block that. But what Caitlin was asking about specifically is something they've kind of done since the summer is the Government Accountability Office gave them this kind of favorable determination that a lot of the Biden administration erred when it didn't send its land use plans to Congress. And so the Interior Department has been sending a lot of land use plans finalized by the Biden administration going back even years, not just, that kind of 60-day period. And so they've been able to basically nullify Biden administration rules for portions of Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, and the NPRA and ANWR. So, the Interior Department has really, been saved the work of having to repeal these rules, a process that can take years, and you can run afoul of procedure and get sued by environmental groups and all this. Kind of Congress, cleared the slate for them. So now it's going to be a lot simpler to go for what Interior Secretary Doug Burgum talks about, drill baby drill and mine baby mine. I don't know if he's paying royalties to Sarah Palin, but I think he's co-opted that as his own these past few months.
Um, so one of the things you both have mentioned is the Trump administration's focus on acceleration. They want to move quickly. They want to build and drill and produce and export as quickly as possible, all things energy, except as we've mentioned, solar and wind and other renewables. Um, what specifically is being done toward these faster approvals of projects, and what are the challenges of such an approach? Kelly, you want to start with that, or David too, either one?
Sure. Um, so yeah, this is an administration that has a lot of, I think it's fair to say, disdain for traditional government processes. They are trying to accelerate a number of things, particularly in the energy space. And I think that's largely a response to the increasing demand that we've talked about. But one of the things that they're really hoping, and I've said this a couple times now, they're really going all in on nuclear. They're hoping to quadruple nuclear power in the US by the year 2050. That's a pretty lofty goal. Right now, nuclear makes up about 19 or 20% of the US energy mix, and there's been some investment and expansion in traditional large-scale nuclear fission reactors, sort of the type that you would think of when you think of nuclear energy. Um, so this administration has had an $80 billion deal with Westinghouse to build some new reactors, and they're also working on restarting one of the reactors at the facility formerly known as 3 Mile Island. So that got some attention recently. But you're right, Caitlin, that there has been also an effort to look ahead to some new technologies, accelerate getting some of these new things online. In particular, they're really hoping to develop and deploy small modular nuclear reactors. And the hope of those new technologies is that they would make nuclear power both safer and easier to scale, as I mentioned before. DOE is using nuclear startups to do some R&D on those designs with the aid of the National Lab System right now. They're trying to test some of these things on federal lands. Part of the benefit of doing that research at approved national lab sites under DOE authority and supervision is that you don't need to go through the same process with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission during the testing phase. So historically, there's been a pretty strict firewall between DOE and the NRC, with DOE in charge of promoting different forms of energy, in this case, nuclear, and NRC in charge of regulating nuclear. So one of the challenges here is that DOE is taking a little bit of heat for using their authority to fulfill some of these testing requirements. It's come up in several hearings pertaining to the NRC on Capitol Hill over the last few months. These concerns that the White House might have undue influence over the nuclear sector in a way that might compromise safety, those concerns coming primarily from Democrats. Um, but the administration is hoping that in pushing some of these technologies forward, they're going to sort of skirt some of the historically long and arduous NRC approval process, and they're hoping to speed some of that up by doing some of this testing on DOE land. But there was also an executive order signed by President Trump earlier this year that was aimed at reforming the NRC. So how that comes together is going to be interesting to watch. But one of the guidelines for that was a much stricter timeline from application to decisions on some of these designs and facilities that they would bring down to 18 months, which in some cases cuts the approval time by half. So pretty big goals here.
And you mentioned that they want at least three of those SMR projects to be to reach criticality
Yes,
by
by next
July
July.
4th of
Mhm.
this coming year. So what are people saying about that? Does that seem doable?
I've gotten a mixed response on that. Some folks in industry will say, the government is supporting that effort and they're hopeful that they can meet that goal. I have also had folks tell me, you know, anytime you see a program like this that has a very ambitious goal, the timeline's probably going to move. So I think the overall consensus here is it's an ambitious goal. They're doing what they can to try to meet it. I don't know how likely it is that they actually have three reactors to criticality by July 4th, but I will say, they're looking at a wide range of authorities and a wide range of things that they can do, with funding and some of these different projects to try to advance this technology across a wide range of means. And in doing so, they may very well reach this goal. It's hard to say at this point.
Is it more likely that they would succeed in a place like 3 Mile Island, in an older facility that, while aged and decommissioned even in some cases, at least
Mhm.
has the infrastructure as opposed to dealing with God knows how many lawsuits, God knows how many permits to construct a new facility somewhere, even if it is a smaller reactor. It seems like, I mean, when you drive across the Susquehanna River going into Harrisburg, you can kind of see off in the distance the 3 Mile Island. It's there. It's been there for decades,
Mhm.
but that's a different thing in putting one in somebody's backyard, right?
Sure. So there's a difference between those two things, and I should be clear about this. The restarting of one of the reactors at 3 Mile Island is not the reactor that experienced a meltdown. So
Right.
we want to be clear about that. There was a reactor that was taken out of use a few years ago that they're trying to restart. That is a fundamentally different concept than trying to develop these small modular reactors, because this is a new technology that the hope is that they would A, be safer, B, be smaller so that they're more easy to scale, by which I mean you could make them in factories and plop them wherever you want them to go. That's sort of the hope and dream of the SMRs. And in doing so, you could sort of be more specific about how you want to use them in order to meet energy demand in places where it needs it. That's a different question. And because the technology hasn't fully been developed yet, it's hard to say how long it's going to take. Whereas the prospect of restarting one of the 3 Mile Island reactors is different because we already know how that works. We already know how to get it back online. And I believe one of the big tech companies is funding part of that effort. So that is just a fundamentally different prospect. But I think the SMRs are like this hot new thing, and they're really hoping to develop this technology as quickly as possible, in part to deal with the AI data center question, because they're hoping, I mentioned this briefly before, but they're looking at some DOE sites, they're assessing the ability to co-locate these SMRs with AI data centers, by which I mean you sort of put the two of them together and use one to power the other. So they're researching those capabilities now. So it's much more of an R&D thing when you're looking at SMRs.
Insurance companies will love that.
I'll briefly say I live not far from Parsons, Kansas, where the Bay Area company Deep Vision has announced that it's going to drill a mile deep hole in the earth and drop an SMR. And they're kind of excited down there about the prospect of jobs, but they're also a little nervous because, you mentioned Three Mile Island, and that alone just brings up the fears, about the industry and the safety issues. Is there
Mhm.
a is there a PR project here that the government's going to have to include in their plans to convince, people that this is going to be safe and that moving it as quickly as possible is going to be safe?
I mean, there very well could be. There are certainly some folks, particularly of a particular generation, that have seen some of these meltdowns happen, that still have concerns about nuclear. I think one of the things about SMRs that the administration and the industry is really excited about is they have some different safety capabilities. They have different shut-off features, so they don't require quite as many personnel to run and make safe. So I think that's part of if there is any sort of a PR effort for SMRs, I think that's going to be part of it, is that, these are smaller reactors. So if there were some sort of a safety situation, the impact would be less, but also they have new features that are supposed to keep them safer. I still think, there is a certain portion of the general population who may or may not be sold on that. So there could be an issue when it comes to trying to site some of these projects and finding areas of the country that are willing to take them. It just sort of depends on the need and the willingness of those communities.
David, one of the complaints that we've had on the time factor for getting these projects online in all aspects of energy um, production is the permitting process. And you have been covering that efforts to change that process to speed it up in Congress. Can you talk about that? What the project for us? What's going on
Mhm.
there and what we can look for?
Yeah, so we're actually kind of in the middle of what one congressional office told me is the 12 days of permitting ahead of Congress leaving for Christmas. Um, so permitting reform is, people have wanted to change the permitting system for years now, but kind of this push we're seeing right now really began immediately after the IRA. And a lot of Democrats kind of got on board this rather large idea of permitting reform or overhaul, I should say. So Republicans have argued for decades the permitting system, is too difficult to navigate, too easily exploited by environmental groups, and makes it too hard to build. And Democrats have kind of less have not agreed with that as much, but really now a lot of Democrats will tell you we need to build for environmental reasons. We need to build wind, solar, geothermal, nuclear. We need as much energy that does not generate greenhouse gas emissions. So a lot of Democrats now, really everyone in Congress, I think, we would agree in some way with the idea we need to have permanent overhaul. What the Republicans are focusing on right now is really, so this week they're doing a bill that would change how the Clean Water Act permits operate. That's something that, basically any large energy project kind of needs a Clean Water Act permit to move forward. And there would be changes such as making it so that states can't veto a project over Clean Water Act concerns, which some like New York, Washington State have blocked projects like a coal export terminal in Seattle or in Washington State, I should say, that they blocked due to Clean Water Act reasons. So the Republican bill kind of take a little bit of authority from states, and they were doing another bill that would change how pipelines are permitted. But the biggest bill next week is going to be changes to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And that one it would narrow the scope of NEPA. So every major federal action needs a NEPA review. It would change what a federal action is so that fewer projects would need to be critiqued. It would make it so that you would have fewer people would have standing to sue over a project, which is one of the big complaints of NEPA, is that it's too easy to bring a lawsuit, and that Republicans say there are far too many nuisance lawsuits brought under NEPA. And this bill is likely going to pass the House next week. There is some objection from kind of the right wing of the Republican Party over the bill that I know Chairman Westerman's still trying to navigate. House Natural Resources Chairman Bruce Westerman from Arkansas is still trying to navigate. But it's likely going to pass the House. In the Senate, it faces there's some members like the ranking member of Energy and Natural Resources and Martin Heinrich of New Mexico, and the ranking member of Environment and Public Works, Sheldon Whitehouse, both really support permitting overhaul, but they've said this really isn't the bill in their mind. Excuse me. So there's still hope in the new year that they can reach some agreement, but it likely won't be this bill that's going to pass the House next week. And Democrats also want to do something about the president's authority to be able to cancel projects, because they're really mad about how Trump has canceled offshore wind. Ranking member Whitehouse is from Rhode Island. That project was huge for his state, both in terms of jobs and in terms of gigawatts. So I would say, people are still hopeful. We're going to be going into year 4 of permitting debate, and everyone seems to think this is going to be the year for whatever reason. It is always hard to pass any kind of major legislation in an election year, but everyone's still at the negotiating table, is what I've been told.
What are environmentalists saying about all of this? How are they weighing in?
Yeah, well, It does kind of depend what exactly you mean by environmentalists. Also, I would say there's been kind of a divorce of two major components of the environmental movement because clean energy groups are kind of finding themselves more on, the kind of in the aligning themselves with like big oil. There was a letter last week signed by both American Clean Power and all the fossil fuel organizations, industry trade groups. So environmentalists, kind of like the Sierra Club and, groups in that vein, are pretty critical of the legislation. They think changes to NEPA aren't really the issue. A lot of them think that there's just not enough staffing is the issue. Any changes to NEPA are kind of going to be ineffective because with all the rifts and layoffs in the federal government, there just isn't the staff to do any sort of review, whether it be the kind of current NEPA review or even a pared back NEPA review. The Biden administration actually tried to increase staff, but that's been largely rolled back. But they also don't want to see their ability to challenge projects taken away. One of the changes would be that you have to have both like filed a comment and be directly impacted by a project. And a lot of national groups have partnered with, smaller groups directly affected by the project. And they're also concerned by making it shortening the timeline to bring a lawsuit that you're basically saying, well, if you find harm down the road, you aren't going to be able to raise your hand. Maybe a project looks good on day one and it looks terrible on day 1000. Day 1000 would be too late to bring that lawsuit. So that's their big concerns for the moment.
That's interesting. Um, Speaking of environmentalists, Kelly, this summer we had some interesting decisions out of the EPA and Department of Energy on the endangerment finding, the Obama era finding that guided federal policy on regulating emissions. Where are we in that process? And can you tell us a little bit about it? And what are the repercussions of such a move?
Sure. So the endangerment finding, for those who don't know, is the 2009 determination by the EPA that greenhouse gas emissions pose a threat to public health. And because of that determination, greenhouse gas emissions are required to be regulated under the EPA's authority because they pose a public health threat. Now, the Trump administration has proposed repealing this finding, which would have the effect of making moot any regulations based on it, perhaps most notably the EPA's tailpipe emissions. So they've made that proposal with a variety of justifications, saying that in the last 16 years since this finding was made, our understanding of the law has changed, our understanding of the science has changed. And part of what they're pinning that change on is this report from the Department of Energy that came out on the same day that the EPA proposed repealing the finding, which challenged a lot of long-standing understanding of climate science. And folks in the climate science world have really come out against this report in droves and said it cherry picks the science. It's trying to draw a particular conclusion for a policy purpose, and they're accusing the EPA of pinning their proposal on this report while ignoring a vast body of evidence that global warming is a real threat. Um, so if the EPA actually does go through with their plan to repeal the finding, that means we're going to see a rollback of some other laws as well. But they're saying, oh, we no longer have the statutory authority to regulate greenhouse gases under this finding because they don't think it's accurate any longer. It's worth noting here that while we're talking about the endangerment finding, one of the things that the Trump EPA has said is, oh, it was an Obama era finding, which is technically true. The Obama administration's EPA were the ones who made the endangerment finding. However, this was a process that started under the George W. Bush administration. They were the ones who were charged by the Supreme Court to study whether or not greenhouse gas emissions posed a public health threat. And there's a lot of reporting on this if you go back into the archives, but basically, the understanding of what happened was the Bush administration made a similar finding, but then chose really not to act on it. So the Obama administration came in, made the finding, made rules based on it, and now we have the endangerment finding and related tailpipe emissions. Um, so if the proposed rescission, which happened in late July, goes through, I suspect we're going to see immediate lawsuits. We've already seen hundreds of people show up to the public comment period that happened this summer. There was a days-long virtual hearing process held by the EPA to consider public comment. Most of those people were in opposition to this proposal. There were a few folks from industry and political action groups that came out and said this would be a good thing because it would get rid of some overburdensome regulations within the auto industry in particular. But if they choose to go ahead with this, it would really just be the agency removing its own authority to regulate greenhouse gases, which most experts that I have talked to say flies in the face of decades of environmental science.
And in fact, we just recently had a decision or by a court in Massachusetts on the climate working group, which from the Department of Energy, which they put together to put together their findings on greenhouse gas emissions and the cause of them. Is that right?
Yeah, so the Climate Working Group is the group assembled by Energy Department Secretary Chris Wright to make this climate report that the EPA referenced in its proposal to rescind the endangerment finding. There was a case filed by the Environmental Defense Fund and Union of Concerned Scientists in the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts that got at a lot of the claims I had mentioned before, that they cherry-picked the science, they violated some of the laws governing how science can be used in policy. So they've made this complaint. It's been going through the courts. Earlier this week, the judge ruled that the Energy Department has to release some of the documentation and records from this group's activities and how they came to some of these conclusions in this report. So there's a lot of this one's controversial, and I imagine it's going to stay in the courts for quite a while, regardless of how it goes.
Thank you for that. Jason, do you have any questions from our audience or anything you want to
Just
bring up?
checked, but I will check one more time here just to make sure we're not missing anything. Again, if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. But we have a clean slate there. So if we
All
want
right.
to go to
All
our
right. We
electoral question.
that means we're doing a good job answering their questions. So let's look ahead, guys. What are you both watching for next year? It's an election year. It could be pivotal to Congress. It could be pivotal to the administration's ability to implement these policies. David, we'll start with you. I know you mentioned that, they trying to get NEPA over the line, or the permitting reforms over the line during an election year, that could be a tough job.
Yeah,
Other
it'll
things.
it'll be interesting to see how people come, back from this Christmas break, if the momentum will still be there for permitting a change to permitting in any way. But I think the biggest thing for this election year is just going to be how do people approach this affordability debate? One of our political reporters and I did a story over the summer that the Democrats just really think they have a winning message in affordability and in electricity. And they're actually recruiting and running a lot of people who have experience working in kind of the affordability and energy sector in a couple kind of key states. I know there's one candidate in Arizona um, that we mentioned in our story. And I think it'll put them kind of at a divide with the Trump administration, and especially in some of these districts where we were talking about, they've seen benefits from wind. A lot of Iowa farmers have had their farms become profitable again or made more money off of the fact that they can locate a wind turbine on the farm. Are those people, in Iowa's 4 seats, how are those people going to think that what the Trump administration's doing? Maybe they would like to see a change. There's a district in Virginia that's currently held by Jen Kiggins, that she has a very, very large offshore wind project that could really, which is led by Dominion that could really have the opportunity to power her district and possibly even, lower energy bills for not just her district, but for a lot of the Commonwealth of Virginia. So it'll be interesting to see how those voters react, and how do these people running in these districts, or Republicans running in these districts, feel they have the kind of lane to separate themselves from Trump on some of these issues? Are they going to maybe, once they've won their primaries and, don't need his support as much, are they going to be a little more challenging of what the Energy, Interior, and EPA are doing? Are they going to be more vocal in their support for some of these projects the Trump administration's been pretty skeptical of? So that's one thing I'm really going to be watching for the next year.
And what about the president himself? I know he started to talk about affordability, but is that a tough line for the president in office at the time to be discussing prices and economics?
I mean, yeah, definitely. I think, some of the Democrats who, are a little more kind of willing to be introspective have kind of been like, Trump's running into the same exact problems Joe Biden ran into last year, where, you can say, you kind of get into that argument, well, the fundamentals of the economy are fine. And do people buy that? Do people like say, like, when you look at your electricity bill, and, as I was saying, they've gone up, 40% over the past 5 years. I don't think people take much solace in the fundamentals of the economy. I mean, how many of us even know what that phrase really means at the end of the day? I mean, the fundamentals for a lot of voters are, what do my energy bills look like? Is that project that could, give my kid a job when he graduates getting built? Those are going to be the fundamentals to those people. So yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, it's the same thing. Like earlier this summer, talking with one of our colleagues on a podcast about, it's the egg price debate from last year. It's like, yeah, the fundamentals are strong, but my eggs are too expensive. My energy is too expensive, and I would like to be able to blast my AC next summer without, worrying about my pocketbook. So that's going to be the big issue.
And even with this focus on acceleration, Energy Information Administration put out their short-term outlook this week, and it shows the share of of electricity generation that each source of power, nuclear, wind, coal, etc., that they have for U.S. energy generation. And it really hasn't changed in a year, and they don't really project it to change much in 2026 either. And so it's going to take a while for these initiatives by the administration on nuclear or on drilling in Alaska or wherever to really have some kind of effect, isn't it, on prices and on supply and demand or in consumption, right?
Yeah, I mean, really, I mean, energy, you're talking about years long lead times. So everything, we've talked about and what Kelly has talked about, like, yeah, you can do whatever you want to get a small modular reactor quicker, to get, 3 Mile Island, you know, to support these projects, but you're not going to see them, definitely not before the midterms, and maybe not even into the next administration at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the problem the Biden administration ran into as well. You can't bring on these projects quick enough to for people to see the benefit immediately.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Well, thank you for that, David. Kelly, what are you looking at for next year?
Well, obviously, affordability is going to be a big one, as David mentioned. But I also think one of the questions that are going to be on the minds of voters, in addition to what does my electric bill cost, is going to be how reliable is my energy? I think, especially as we're heading into the winter months and we get a higher risk of outages, that could be something that creates some political pressure. We've already seen the Department of Energy implement some emergency orders to keep certain power plants running after their retirement dates and to keep certain sections of those plants online in order to help deal with demand, citing the need as we're heading into the colder season. So they seem to already be preparing for this idea that we might be seeing some outages this winter. So I think both within the areas of affordability and reliability, we're going to start to see some more public pressure emerging. And especially too, we've talked a lot today and every day about data centers. And because of the increasing needs of data centers, they're going to put more pressure on the grid. They've already been doing so. I think we're only at the beginning of that. So I think when you think about affordability and reliability, you also have to think about AI and the expansion of AI. So as of yet, there hasn't really been a concerted response from the federal government to the energy needs posed by AI. It's something they're certainly thinking about. They have these initiatives, but as David just said, some of these things are really hard to do quickly. And so I don't know that there's going to be a solution in a timely fashion to deal with some of these issues. And even though the administration has just launched this major AI initiative, we covered the Genesis mission recently, this new initiative to harness federal data in a new AI platform to deal with some of the major issues of the day. Some of these things are very lofty goals, but I think when you have people who are struggling with cost, they're struggling to even access energy in the first place, and potentially more people seeing those challenges, that's going to be something that could really um, galvanize voters in the fall. It could have some real political consequences.
Well, thank you both for those are something it'll be an interesting year next year for sure.
Mhm.
Jason, I'm going to turn this over to you again.
All right, I'm going to make one last check of the Q&A box. I hope people didn't feel too shy, or I hope, as you said, Caitlin, we just answered so many questions before they could be asked. We also have, I want to put on a share screen for a QR code that we have, and also a little bit more information about some of our editorial products right here. Thank you very much on that. Yeah, we've just got a couple minutes left, but I want to thank, Kelly, David, Caitlin, for this conversation. Before we sign off, I want to make sure that if you're interested in receiving CQ's coverage of all of these topics and other critical actions that shape energy legislation and regulation, please check out our CQ Capital Power newsletter. You got the URL there for information about subscribing. It's published daily when Congress is in session, and our weekly CQ Energy, Environment, and Transportation newsletter. Also, we really do value your opinions and thoughts. So if you would take just a few minutes of your time to take our quick confidential survey on the biggest trends in government affairs this year, you can just do it by clicking on that QR code. Thanks again for your time and sharing it with us. Thank you again to our panelists and to those of you who RSVP'd and participated in our webinar. It's great to have you, and we look forward to more webinars on this and other topics in the future. Coming up next month will be one on the legislative preview for 2026. Meantime, thanks so much and have a great week.